Well, good morning, class. It is week 6 here with Fruitland Baptist Bible College online, and I hope that you're working your way through the course and enjoying all that we've got to do and get to do for the Lord. I apologize that it's Thursday and you're just now getting the video or the lecture. I've been away actually in Greensboro on for our church, representing our church for the North Carolina Baptist State Convention. I just want to say how awesome that experience was. It was a phenomenal time of worship, refreshment, and honestly, revival. So sorry to leave you hanging. I do want to let you know of a few of announcements for this class. Being that it's week 6, we're working on project number 3 right now, and by the end of this week, everybody should be graded up to project 2. So everybody should be caught up by the end of the week. I'm working hard to make sure that grades are turned in and done right. So everybody should have an update on how they're doing in the class. Also, you'll have a quiz this week. This will be your second quiz, or third quiz. Sorry, your third quiz out of 4. It'll cover weeks 5 and lecture notes from this week as well, week 6. So listen closely, but you're allowed to use your notes, of course, on that quiz. And you have reading to do in chapter 7 of your first 2 years in youth ministry. So make sure that you read chapter 7 as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started in a conversation about fellowship. So the lesson today is about pulling our church youth. Remember, we've got crowd students for evangelism, and now we're going to talk about the church students, those that are with you on a regular basis on Sundays, Wednesdays, and are pretty faithful to be with you through your events and things like that. We're talking about pulling students together for fellowship, to do life together. A lot of times when we hear the word fellowship, we default immediately to a dinner that's scheduled, through the church in the fellowship hall. But just because you have a fellowship hall and just because you have dinner doesn't mean that you have fellowship. Fellowship goes way beyond just a meal. Fellowship is about a student loving another student so much that they would share Christ together. They would share community together. They would want to spend more than just church time together. They would want to spend their lives together in the Lord. And so fellowship is something that you can't manufacture. It's something that you can promote. It's something that you can push. It's something that you can encourage. But it's something that God has to do, that God has to minister through the hearts of your students and your leadership to help see that happen. Unfortunately, I've been in some situations as a youth minister where fellowship just didn't happen, and the students didn't want it to happen, and honestly, some of the parents didn't want it to happen, and so it's a hardship. It's something that you have to stress, and something that you've got to want. It's something that you have to feel, so that your students can experience it. So I want to talk to you about a few things today concerning fellowship. You'll find those things in your notes as well, but I want to go ahead and share those with you today. The first is this: fellowship must be purposeful. Fellowship must be purposeful. And what do I mean by that? That fellowship must be purposeful. That means that you have to purpose in your heart to want to see fellowship happen. Again, it doesn't just happen overnight. You can't just say, okay, let's everybody get together and let's have fellowship. No, fellowship goes way beyond that. So fellowship must be purposeful. What I mean by that is that students should care for one another. Students should love one another. They should know one another. That's that first blank. Students should know one another. If you look at the example in Acts chapter 2, you see that taking place. You see fellowship just automatically happening. Why? Because the people genuinely cared about each other. There was a community of faith in the early church. The second thing that you see is students should care for one another, but then next you see that students should hold each other accountable. Accountability is a strong word. Accountability is something that's often ran from too, and so when we're talking about biblical accountability, we're talking about not just somebody saying, "Oh, you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're wrong," completely calling out their sin the moment that you see them, or somebody looking over your back. That's I guess that could be considered accountability. But when I say accountability, I mean that there's a friendship, and because they love each other so much and they care about each other so much, that they want to hold each other accountable in the sense that they call you out on sin, or they make sure that you're doing fine spiritually on purpose. Like they care about your soul before they care about whether or not there's sin in your life. And I'm thankful for all those that are in my life that biblically hold me accountable. It's bigger than just saying, Peter, you need to get this sin fixed, or Peter, you need to watch how you say this or that. No, it goes beyond that. Reaches to the heart. So students should hold each other accountable. The next one is that students should encourage each other. Students should encourage each other. I mean, how often do you see that taking place in your student ministries? How often do you see that, or do you see that taking place in your church family? I'm talking about genuine encouragement. I love the letters of Paul. Right now, our church family is studying 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, and what we've noticed, especially in verse 1, Paul asked for the church to pray for them. And it wasn't like he had a personal need. He prayed for a super spiritual need that God would use Paul to advance the gospel. It encouraged him to see the church praying for one another, it encouraged him to see them spreading the gospel rapidly through Thessalonica and beyond. And so when I say encouragement, I genuinely mean that a student comes alongside of another student and says, I care about you. How can I pray for you? Do you have a need in your life that I can meet? Is there something going on that we can lift up to God together? How is your family? I mean, like going out of the way to say, students, I care about you. I want to see you do well. How can I be of help to you? So students should encourage one another. And that goes to the next point. Students should open to share and pray with one another. Some of the best moments of fellowship that I've ever had with students is when they just opened up. It didn't so much have to do with a lesson that I taught. It didn't have to do with the response that was given, or the response that was had after a message. Some of the best moments of fellowship was when a student said, this is what I have in my life that's going on. I need us to pray about it. I need us to be serious about it. Will you please do that? And God just opened the door for fellowship to happen. So you can try to necessitate that. You can field that in the classroom. You can encourage that to happen. Here's the next thing. Fellowship must be protected. Fellowship must be protected. If you look in Hebrews chapter 3, the writer of Hebrews was making a strong warning, saying that make sure that your own hearts are not evil and unbelieving, turning away from the living God. You must warn each other every day while it's still today, so that none of you will be deceived by sin and hardened against God. I think that it needs to be said and remembered that you have an enemy, and he hates your fellowship, he hates your students, he hates your ministry, he hates the gospel. And one thing that he wants to do is he wants to destroy and discourage and deter fellowship from happening. You are a chief protector of the flock. You have a responsibility to love your flock, to nurture your flock, to protect your flock. And that means that when you see fellowship being hindered or hurt, even if it's by another student, even if it's by a parent, even if it's by a member of your team, you have to stand up against it. I'll tell you about a dream that I had one time. It's been a few years back. I was ministering to our students, and this was the dream that I had. I don't know if you're like me. I believe that God can speak to us in dreams and in visions. So I'm not your typical Baptist, I guess. But I had a dream, and it involved several of our students, and they were standing. Our church has a bridge that the bridges are two parking lots. So there's a creek and covered bridge. Well, the dream that I had was that there were students in our youth group standing on one side of the bridge, and then there was they were holding hands, and then on the other side of the bridge were these dark figures, and I thought that maybe they were of the enemy, but the dark figures were standing on the other side of the bridge, and there was just this wicked face of just wicked face of hatred or envy, or even determination to get to the other side. And our students were trying to hold hands and stay together. These two were trying to get to the other side, wanting in. And normally, like, some people would listen to that dream and say, "Wow, that could be two lost students wanting to get to the other side into the fellowship." And I respect that interpretation. But I really believe, knowing how unsettled I was after that dream, I really believe that the two wanted to harm the fellowship. And you have to know the context of the dream. In that time, the fellowship of our youth group was being hindered and was even being threatened by outside forces and even inside forces. Students were very critical. Parents were critical and complaining, and they were trying to find everything they could wrong with the church, and they just wanted out. I mean, it was a really bad season in the life of our student ministry. But I can recall God just pressing on my heart: protect your students, protect the fellowship. How about this next one? Fellowship must be pursued. Fellowship must be pursued. If you want it to happen in your youth group, it will happen. It can happen. You have to value that, though, among your church students. So every student should feel needed, which means that when they're missing out, you're the first one to say, I want you here. I really want you to be here. How about every student should feel nurtured? That means they should feel cared for. To nurture means to faithfully help a student grow in their relationship with God through providing an environment that encourages growth. So here's some ways that you can pursue fellowship in your student ministries. First is that students should receive phone calls. I know that that's not necessarily a biblical thing, say get a phone call, but I do believe that a student should be contacted often. When you start to see a student wander, it's not going to take long for them to get out of touch and out of practice for being there. So you should say, I genuinely want you to be there. I hope that you'll come. I want you to be there. So students should receive phone calls. Students should receive information for growth. The next one, students should contact their peers. If you want to see fellowship take off in your student ministries, how about you give the student a responsibility to reach out to another student and say, "Hey, we miss you. We want you to be here. We care about you." Students should keep their parents informed. The best way to keep a group together is to keep your families plugged into what's going on. So I encourage a monthly meeting. Maybe you want to have more than a monthly meeting, but I encourage you to have at least a monthly meeting with your parents so that they know to have their student there. And then students should also experience spiritual things. What I mean by that is that they should have an encounter with God on a regular basis, and that's your responsibility to feel that, to see that happen, to allow that to happen. So let's ask this question: what's the overall goal of fellowship? The goal is that students should become family. You want that to happen. You pray for that to happen. Students should want to become family and participate in one another's life. And then there's the last thing: fellowship. I think fellowship must be provided. Fellowship must be provided. I'm sorry, that's not even on your answer sheet, but fellowship must be provided. So many words. You can implement fellowship in your weekly and monthly gatherings. Sunday, Wednesdays are great opportunities to provide fellowship together. So here's what I envision. Okay, if you're having a worship service or student ministry night, here's what I envision to help with the fellowship. One is that you should have a genuine welcome. How you start a service is vital. I'm always trying to doctor the way that I say hello at our church. I think that you should want them to know that you're glad that they're there. Maybe even involve the students and letting each other know that you're glad you're there. Sometimes a moment of fellowship where you give a student a high five, or you take a moment to talk amongst each other to kind of unwind and catch up, that kind of thing. So welcome each other, receive one another. Maybe there's an icebreaker that has questions that will, or an activity that will get students to focus on one another and laughing together and playing together, even thinking together. How about worship? Worship is fellowship too. Fellowship can happen in the worship service as well. Letting students be active in prayer and praise, giving students that responsibility, that hands-on experience to pray over the youth group. It's the same thing with the praise part. Picking songs that they know well, picking songs that they can praise God together with, finding songs that have super meaning, and no, not just shallow surface level songs, but picking praise that would encourage fellowship, interaction together. Also, it goes beyond the songs. But how about a time of prayer with your students where they get to voice their prayer needs? Maybe even ask about a prayer update. How about this? Turning your heart towards God's song, testimony, celebration, and meditation on the Word. And then, of course, there's the Word of God. I encourage you, if you want fellowship to happen in your youth group when you teach, I encourage active learning to take place. So it goes beyond just you giving a sermon, but it gives a chance for your fellowship to respond to the messages. So I encourage you to challenge them. I encourage you to discuss the passages together. I encourage you to ask questions that they can respond to. And then the last thing is wisdom. Wisdom is when you apply the knowledge of the Word. And so you want to help students apply. Oh, excuse me. Oh man, I'm boring myself today. Our goal in this period is to help students apply what they learn. Students are challenged to be doers of the Word and not just hearers of the Word. So to build fellowship, I would encourage, after your time of praise and in prayer, and after your time of preaching, I would encourage students to get into small groups and talk about how they can do the Word that week. And so groups need to discuss application questions that will help them gain wisdom. So those are some tips on encouraging fellowship, how to do life together. I'm really interested in seeing how you respond this week in your discussion forum. So take a look at that. Let's talk about fellowship. I encourage you to respond once on the post, but also respond to your classmates as well. Encourage healthy dialogue. So there's your lesson on fellowship. I hope that you're having a great week. I'll see you next week.